Hi, everyone. We're going to get started as people are starting to trickle in. Um, Thank you for being here, and I just want to thank our partners, exocad, for doing this webinar on implant planning. We also have Dr. Saba here. We have Dave with exocad. We also have Dr. Saba here to kind of talk about the exoplan from a clinical point of view. And I'm Holly Burns. I'm with Aesthetic Professionals. We are an education center, a lab, and a distribution center. And since the basis of our company is education, we wanted to take this time where a lot of people are off right now and provide you with free webinars on digital dentistry. You can see the ones that we currently have scheduled. We're going to have more as time goes on. We're going to be adding, hopefully, over the next few days. And these are some of our partners that are putting them on for us. And if you have anything that you're interested in learning, I did send out an email to everybody, and you can send us an email and let us know, and we can take that into consideration. Let's see here. Dave, if you could kind of pull that page down. We do have, yeah. If this isn't, a sales seminar, but I did kind of want to let you know that we right now, all of our exocad software is going to be 15% off for the next month. And we also have deals on our equipment and our other financing. Yeah, you can keep it right there. And then we also have some great finance options where you have 6-month deferral, and then some with a 6-month deferral, and then really low payments for the rest of the year. So I just wanted to bring that up. If you have any questions regarding that, you can talk to either Jesse or I. That's our information. And like I said, you should have received an email before the webinar, but then I will send another one with a follow-up. During the webinar, if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. And there's a way you should be able, just send it to the organizers and panelists. We're going to be reviewing them, and as we go through, we'll try to get to all of them. So I think that's it. Dave, go ahead and get started.
All right, great. Thank you, Holly, and welcome everyone. My name is Dave Carriera, and I'm with exocad America. And I'd also like to thank one of our panelists, Michael Saba, or Dr. Michael Saba. We met, I think, a couple of years ago, Mike, and we brought Mike on as a beta tester because he was in a unique position where he was providing education, and he was utilizing some of our products in an educational format. And I thought he was a really good person to be able to provide us feedback and also give us some additional direction on the future of the product and some features that were lacking or are necessary. So Mike has now, for the last few months, been working with our upcoming release. So he does have some additional insight that I'm sure we'll share at the end of the session. Mike, do you want to say anything?
Thanks, Dave. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good. Again, thanks for having me. Glad to answer any questions that you or the participants may have with regards to exoplan from the clinical perspective. And it's a very powerful software, great for planning and executing cases. So looking forward to helping however I can.
Great. So what you see on the screen right now is what we call the Dental DB. It's a way to organize the cases, more or less a case manager for your digital workflows. And this is seen and observed throughout our entire platform. So whether you're using chairside CAD, dental CAD, or exoplan, which are our 3 product categories, you'll be quite familiar with this screen. And this is pretty much how you tell the software, this is what I'm doing. And in this case, we just defined that we're working on an anatomical crown from a restorative standpoint. And once we're in here, we could also define whether this will be a custom abutment, or we're going to use a stock abutment, or we can decide later. So simple as that. You have also different parameters and controls within that as well. So we'll go ahead and just jump right into the demonstration here. And anytime I do any of these live, I always throw out a disclaimer. This is technology. We're rendering live. Hopefully we don't see any sort of lags or crashes because we are streaming at the same time that we're running software. I must say though that exocad runs very stable on many systems, even with low PC requirements. So we shouldn't experience any of that. So what you see here is that the optical scans were loaded automatically. And when you work with a company like EP or some of our resellers that integrate their equipment into the platform, as you're producing your scans, they're being saved in the correct format to where the rest of our products can just look into that case directory and import that automatically without you having to go in and select the file. We haven't done that yet with DICOM information because there are so many different sources, and we wanted to just make it as flexible as possible. So the first prompt here is to select where the DICOM is. And in this case, we just kept it in the same directory. So if I open up my case directory here, you see that we have the lower and upper jaw scans, and then we have a folder here for the DICOM. So that's what we're looking at right now. So that's just in this directory tree here. I select DICOM and we say OK. Now this imports all of the information. So we have the DICOM and all in the same scene. Set the threshold value based on what we want to see. All right. And there's a number of different tools up here that are available. For one, surface generation allows you to generate a surface. So if you wanted to print a medical model, you can set this threshold to what you want that surface to be generated from, and it will do that. Once you have that, then you can use different tools to kind of edit out some of the unnecessary stuff. There are some additional options here, like making this visual semi-transparent to where you can see structures underneath it. Also clipping tools, so if you wanted to crop the image from different angles, you can certainly do that as well. Apart from those, we also have some additional visuals here. So you can visualize things as if you were looking at an X-ray. So this is just the volumetric data here in an X-ray view format. And then we also have these solid slices, which are not so useful now, but this is actually what we present as we go through and slice this image up so that we can do our implant planning. All right, so that's a quick overview on those structures there. All right, the first wizard screen is where we have the opportunity to define some of these hotkeys up here. So we can say, you know, let's declare that this is the soft tissue. In this case, it doesn't really help, right? If you had a full face where maybe you were overlaying a face scan from a face scanner, that might be something useful. So we'll just skip that, and we'll go ahead and define the bone density. So we'll just adjust that to about that threshold level. And then we could bring this down to where we see the teeth. And I'll explain why this one is an important one. But selecting the enamel will help us with the alignment process a little bit later. The next step here is to provide you an opportunity to correct the tilt or the direction, the axial direction or plane of the scan. In this particular case, it's oriented properly. The patient was in the device correctly, but as you can imagine, sometimes maybe the patient has a slight cant or was not positioned correctly, tilted too far down or something like that. So this provides you with an opportunity to correct that occlusal plane or axial direction, and then your image slices later on in the program will be updated accordingly. In this case, I'm just going to reset it to the default view. It's perfectly fine. So this is really the first step where we're actually doing anything to prepare us for the implant planning. And by that, I mean, the first step is to really get these two images aligned. The reason we do this is so that we have a nice clean surface to design our surgical guide on. Also, if you had worked up a wax up model, a virtual wax up, that would be incorporated in the scan over here. So we want to make sure that we can see that in this view here. So we'll go ahead and just get that aligned with the 3-point method, and that gets it in the general vicinity. So what I was mentioning earlier is that I can perform a best fit analysis here, but if you can imagine that this surface doesn't quite match this surface. This is the soft tissue where this is the bone. So if I change this to my enamel setting here, or just minimize the amount of data that the computer is trying to correlate, this will actually yield a better result. So I can start my best fit alignment here. And now the computer will go through an algorithm where it calculates a surface, and then it matches up my optical scan to that of the CT. Mike, do you have any comments on this type of process here?
So it's actually very important that everyone pays attention to setting that to enamel and not anywhere else, because any slight deviation where the STL tries to align itself to the bone, the jaw, will lead to a little bit of discrepancy to where the surgical guide won't fit.
Yeah, or it may fit the patient, but you may be slightly off from your implant site.
Yep.
So something else that I wanted to bring up, and I feel that this is a super powerful tool with an exoplan, is this little tab called Improve Accuracy. And with this, I'm sure all of you have seen the scans that look like that, right? There's tons of scatter. Maybe the patient had a lot of restorations. So you get that scan artifact where the X-ray bounces off of these metal restorations or amalgam, and then it creates all of the scatter in the scene. So it may look something like that. So the advantage is that you can go in here and actually mark specific regions that you feel are going to provide you with a good result. Now, this might take a little bit to calculate the surface here because I just added all of this extra data, but I think it's important enough to just show you this feature because in the past, when we really didn't have a lot of options, I'm talking probably 15 years ago, I was serving in the U.S. Air Force, and we didn't really have implant planning software. We were using industrial CAD solutions to create surgical guides at that time. So it was really at its infancy, and we were coming up with all kinds of ways to get these things aligned. And I know how difficult it can be sometimes. So I really appreciate what they've done with this feature, where I can just say, okay, you know what? I can clearly see that cuspid there, and this one on this side. And if I look around, I see the distal of that last molar there. And let's look around. Okay, I have some occlusal surface of this distal tooth, right? So I can just kind of paint the areas that I can see. And when I say, okay, and I go back to my best fit alignment, the software is pretty much going to ignore all of that extra noise and just focus on those painted areas. So I think that this is a true benefit of having this software and this capability here. And you can kind of see there on the left where it was just matching up those areas. And as you can see on this color map now, this is now relating the surface to this really scattered surface, but the areas that I painted are nice and blue, which indicate a very close match. Now, if I look at this occlusal surface, I have some blue structure here, and the distal that we painted here is also blue. So this, even in a really bad case of scatter, I can feel confident that there's a good alignment on that case.
Dave,
So
I won't redo that. Yeah, go ahead.
Dave, in addition to a lot of scatter in cases, as everyone starts to get into some more complicated cases where there maybe multiple models, waxed up models, or even models where you've deleted teeth, this becomes very useful.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, because sometimes your CT scan has dentition that you no longer have. Maybe that tooth was extracted after the scan was taken. So I think that's what you're referring to, right, Mike?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Holly, did you have a question?
Yeah, somebody was wondering how you handle scatter from metallic restorations.
Oh, that was pretty much it.
Okay.
So the scatter, there's really no way to, let me back up into that scene. So there's really no way to filter that stuff out. You can change the threshold to minimize it, of course. Now, this is a simulation of scatter. I just kind of included enough of a threshold to where we can see some of the soft tissue that's bleeding in. But in a case of scatter, you would probably see it come out horizontally across the surface of the teeth. So this is what we were kind of referring to, where you can kind of find the areas that are visible and just paint them on the model to just have the software focus on specific areas. That's how you would handle those scatter situations. On the other scenes, when you're able to slice through the images, you can kind of, you'll still see the scatter, but you'll be able to see the bone and the implant site a little better than what you would see on a 3D view like this. Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, and then I have one more really quick while you're there. Do you need to have the open mouth or mouth open?
I would recommend that the patient is either biting on a bite fork on the CBCT or insert some cotton swabs. I don't know, Mike, you could probably answer that better. I just tend to have better experience with the mouth open.
Having the ability to overlay an STL with the DICOM allows for a much different experience than before, when we used to rely on a patient biting down to see where the occlusion is going to go. And that's the biggest difference. By opening the bite, you have more surface area for the program to calculate the accuracy to put those two models together. So I would recommend an open byte, because now you're planning everything with two STLs that are in occlusion, versus before, when you told the patient to bite down and you plan your case, you would need them to bite down because we were planning on DICOM only. And I hope that was clear.
Yeah, I think that was very clear. And what Mike means by overlaying the surface data, I don't know if you referred to it as STL, but the surface data is what we'll see it on the next screen. But when we align the lower model as we did, we're aligning the arch that we're planning the implants on. Any other objects that are already correlated or referencing that position will come along and stay in that same position. So if the upper is in alignment to that lower scan, which if you're using an intraoral scanner, for example, normally you scan the lower, the upper, and then a buccal bite scan. And when that software exports that data, it exports it in the same orientation so that those two are in a occlusal relationship together. So whether that was MIP or any other occlusal scheme that you were trying to achieve, that's going to come out of that scanner software, and they're going to be in the right relationship. So when we align it, you'll be able to see both of those data sets together, and you'll see it on the next screen. So we'll get back into that.
And one more thing, Dave, about an open byte CBCT scan. It will reduce scatter also, because even though even enamel can generate a little bit of scatter, but if you have two amalgams or two metal crowns occluding with each other, it may scatter out that area that you need to see. So opening up that bite will reduce some of that scatter.
Yeah, that's a good point, especially in those cases where you have a restoration on the opposing arch that you're not even treating during this time. So that's totally possible for that to wash out an area. So the next step here is to define this panoramic curve. And by the panoramic curve, if we're planning on the lower, you usually want to create a panoramic curve that kind of simulates a pano. And you can make this as large or small. It could just be a specific quadrant if that's all you're interested in seeing. If you're on the upper, that might be a little more like that, right? So it gives you the flex on the area that you really want to see. Planning on the lower. So one of the regions of interest will be the alveolar canal. So what I like to do in this particular stage is I like to get this to the point where I can see that canal almost entirely in that pano. And I'll show you why on the next step here. So I can just kind of introduce that curve there, and even add more buttons if I want to define that a little clearer. So that's just done by switching to the slice mode, which gives me kind of a rolled out view of this orange curve here. So if I take this orange curve and I just flatten it out, that's what I'm seeing down here. So when I manipulate these control points, I can change what that perspective looks like. And then here on the pano, you can control the density of this X-ray noise here. So you can wash it out to where you can kind of see more structure, or bring it down to kind of filter out some of the extra data. And I think some people that have been trained as radiologists prefer to see this in this type of orientation. So you can flip that perspective right there. All right, so just to quickly talk about, just to follow up on that last question that came up, or what Mike was referring to. You know, we aligned this this lower arch, right? So no one ever saw the upper, but the upper was already in the appropriate relationship. So what the software is doing is it's actually bringing the DICOM to the position of this lower arch. And we do that because in our platform, we have other tools that are designing on these models. So if we design a wax up restoration where we're using virtual articulation, or maybe we're designing something as complex as a denture or restoration over a bar or something like that, you want to make sure that all of those objects are in the appropriate relationship. So that will all stay related to the original scan data, and then the DICOM is actually brought into the same coordinate field. So everything else remains the same. All right, so here's the reason why I spend a little extra time to just set that control point to outline that nerve. Because when we're marking and defining this nerve canal, I can pretty much just find the most suitable slice here, and we can kind of scroll through this image back and forth like so. But I find this nice slice here that pretty much presents that nerve all in a single slice. And once I get close to the foramen here, I can just kind of hold my mouse button down. And down here, you can see that foramen open up there. So I can just drag that point to its opening there, and then continue drawing here. And it makes defining the nerve very easy. There's other ways to do it. We can certainly go through and just select a point on each slice on this one here. So you can kind of traverse these slices here. Mike, how do you prefer to do that when you're working?
So Dave, I set my panel curve a little bit differently. So this is kind of user preference, completely
Right.
user preference. And for someone that's not used to the software, I would advise 100% to map this nerve, because it sets a lot of safety features within ExoPlan so that things don't go wrong during the surgery. But I set my curve to the arch, not to the arch of the mandible or the maxilla, depending on the case, at the neck of the teeth, not so much to the canal. And as you go forward, it changes the perspective of how you're viewing the DICOM file when you start manipulating the implant, as far as tangent curves and stuff like that. So that's why I prefer to do a little bit different panel, but I personally don't spend much time defining the nerves.
Okay,
That's
good.
to say that it shouldn't be done, though.
Great. Yeah, so just one last point on the nerves is you can adjust the diameter here. So Mike was mentioning some of the safety parameters, and as you're planning the implant, you'll have a safety boundary that's around the implant, and it's adjustable. But that safety boundary will tell you when it collides with this outline here that you can see on the screen now. So you can adjust that to try to fit the size of the canal there. All right, so I had mentioned that if you are working with a lab that might be doing a wax up, you can import that wax up along with the case data, and all of that information would show up here. We do have a basic tooth library feature here where you can just define a couple of contact points on the adjacent teeth, and a model will be presented, right? And on the next step here, we can have a few more control, or a little more control over positioning and being able to see this in a slice view as well. All right, so these images are created, and with a mouse click here, I can get it to center all of these images into that point. So while we're on this step, I can just kind of reposition that tooth to get it into the appropriate relationship, cus to fossa. We can also scale the tooth if we need to, rotate it, move it up and down. So we have a little bit of control here. So we're not providing you the complete tool set that we have in some of the other products where you can change the anatomy and do things like that. You can select different tooth libraries to just have different basic forms, but the tools here are pretty much limited to moving, rotating, and scaling. Now, something that is nice is we do include the chain mode. And what chain mode is if you have a series of restorations, if you were doing full arch reconstruction here, it would be quite tedious to set these teeth individually. So switching to chain mode lets you scale the complete arch and set a point on each of the distal sides. And then what chain mode does is that as you're moving this, imagine the teeth are all tied up into a rope or a chain. And if you're moving the anterior aspect of this chain forward, all of the teeth are adjusting and scaling while they stay in contact. So it makes it very easy to just create a very quick simulation of where the teeth need to be, so that you can have that perspective as you're planning your implants. So I really, personally, I like chain mode a lot. We're not going to demonstrate it here, but I'm sure we'll have follow-up sessions where we'll do a more complex case and show you some of that functionality. So this is an
if you don't mind,
yeah, go ahead.
Back on a step there. And this is a question for you for some clarity. Because you didn't discuss early on where you're setting your settings on the DB. To put in those points, the mesial and distal points, you have to set your adjacent teeth?
No, you do not.
Okay.
So we just defined it this way to add color to the screen, really. But the main purpose here is to just define the teeth that are going to prompt you for an implant. So we can also add additional implants while we're in let's say that you realized as you're placing this implant that the tooth next to it actually has to come out too. There's a way to edit the plan from within the design session or the planning session and add an additional implant on that side as well.
Okay, and also if you can go back to the slice where you had set up your tooth already. I'll just wait for that to load. And you can go, if you can put the slice to where the tooth is, you can see, this scan, the CT scan, was taken in occlusion. But this is, I think, something you guys are modifying so that the outline of the opposing arch can be shown. This is an easy case because everything's kind of in occlusion correctly, but if you have a crossbite case, it's kind of important to visualize the outline in the cross section of the opposing arch.
Right. Yeah. So like you said, in this case, you can see the opposing, but if that arch was open, what you want to see is the actual outline here. So there is a current way to visualize that. Um,
And I
it
might
doesn't.
vote for this today, but it is possible to do that.
Yeah. So, and actually, I'll cover it because I think it's pretty relevant. We have a wizard mode, so that's what we've been following. And wizard mode will probably handle 95% of the cases that you have. On some occasions, you'll want to switch over to expert mode because you want to visualize an additional mesh, or um, maybe you want to perform some measurements, annotate the case if you're collaborating with a lab, or if you're the lab and you want to point something out to the referring clinician. So I'm going to switch over to the add remove mesh, and if I go here, implant planning, generic collision object, let me bring in the upper as a collision object. So that's the same uppercase or upper scan. But if I go back to my wizard now, I'm still going to be in that step that we just left. But because this is a collision object, I can turn that on and visualize that outline here. So if the case or if the patient was in an open bite during the CT scan, you can still, hopefully you guys can see that. I'm not sure how well it renders in the web session, but it's this light blue line here. And you guys could see that there. All right. And then, you know, you can tweak against that. Is that
and it may be like a small
question?
detail, but this will lead to the best screw retained restoration you get by kind of mapping this out as best as possible, either with a wax up scan or with this overlay.
Yeah, so that is an improvement that we have actually in the version that you're testing, Mike. I believe that that's already implemented. But yeah, that's still possible today by performing that. And I did want to get into that because not just for that reason, but just to give you an example of how easy it is to bring in additional objects that you might be wanting to use as a reference, whether that be a preoperative scan or something else that you might be referencing. It's totally possible to include in here. All right. So this next step provides us with the ability to kind of give us a visual of this bone density here. And what this does is it provides us with a color map over the implant. When we're placing the implant, you'll see red or blue. And the blue is indicated by the areas that we're providing here. So in this case, the bone density on this site is lower than all of the surrounding bone. So we can go in here and just kind of focus on the implant site. And it looks like maybe there was a fresh extraction. You could still see some of the root form there. And you can adjust this threshold to satisfy your clinical requirements. And this is purely visual. It doesn't necessarily mean that this bone is any good at all because CBCT scans are relative. So if you have a lot of scatter, the scatter will kind of bring up the density levels around all of the. It doesn't really correlate to Hounsfield units like do. So CBCTs should be looked at as a tool. In some cases, they're a diagnostic tool, but you have to be very careful with classifying any sort of bone density here. And Mike, I'm sure you have some additional perspective there as a clinician. Something might have looked good on a CT scan, and when you drill in, it's complete mush, right?
Yeah, happens every time, Dave. And I don't really spend much time on this threshold. I mean, if it's way off, then I'll deal with it. but for that reason, I don't spend too much time on this density threshold issue either.
Yeah. And that's an optional step. You could just actually press forward and just avoid that altogether. All right, so now we're at the step where we're placing the implant, and the implant library can be selected here. So we have a number of implant systems that are part of the release. And on our website, we've actually released additional implant libraries that may not be visible here. So please take a look at our integrated libraries to see if your system's already compatible. If not, there's likely another manufacturer that produces implants that are of similar size and diameter, and we do have some open libraries or universal sleeves that can be used just freely to set the depth that you want relative to the bottom of that implant. So we'll get into that a little bit more as we're designing the guide. But for now, I'll just use this this Straumann bone level rock solid guided. And something else I wanted to point out is you can select the little star here, and it flags it as a favorite. So if you're using 1 or 2 implant systems, you can just flag that, and it'll just default to those 2, and keep them at the top of the list so you don't have to find it every time. The next thing you want to do is maybe select the diameter that you want to use, and you can still change this even after you place it. So we'll go ahead and just place one in there. Let's go back to that select screen. So one thing I want to point out is let me hide a couple screens here. Let's reduce that. All right, so you see this little handle here? This correlates to the different sizes that are available for this implant. So you can change that in the 3D view. We can also do that here on these sliced views. And while we're on the screen, another awesome benefit is exocad is well known in the lab space for all of the implant restorative libraries that have been curated over years. So if you select TiBases and you've downloaded the implants that you're commonly using, you'll find a list of compatible TiBases. So in this case, I've downloaded some of the NT Trading libraries that I think are also distributed by EP, and then we have some of the manufacturer stock abutments that are available as well. So if you select one of these NT Trading ones, this is actually a pre-formed titanium or pre-machined titanium blank, and this is used for milling out titanium abutments. So if you had a restoration in its place and you're planning on doing a completely screw retain restoration, well, that might not be a suitable solution here. So this can kind of prompt you to understand, oh, I need to do a custom abutment and then fit an overlaying crown on top of that. Another benefit would be to maybe, let's select one of these cementable crown abutments, and you can visualize that here. Let's look at the cross-sectional. And what I like about this is that being able to see this, you can kind of see where that emergence profile will be and whether you have to bring this implant further down or not. So as with all the libraries, you have usually different platforms and then different diameters and heights available here. So, you know, this is a posterior, or maybe we need to go out to a 6 millimeter transition. That might be a little too high, so let's back that down a little bit. So something like that might be what we want to proceed with. But yeah, just having that in there just provides you with a little bit more insight so that you can plan this case a little better. And then being able to navigate all the way around, and on this 3D view here, you can kind of see the plane as it goes around. And this is also indicated on this axial view. You can just kind of move this in the position that you want to see. So if I look at this relative to the adjacent teeth, I know I need to change my orientation and reposition. So it's really just a matter of going around and taking a look at all the structures around it. Now, going back to some of these safety features, if I get anywhere near that nerve, everything kind of lights up red. So the safety boundary that is displayed here around the implant and the nerve itself, also in the 3D view, will light up. So if you're in a situation where that nerve is really close, you'll see that visual and be alerted. Also, take notice of how the implant colors are changing. That's related to that highlighting that we did on the previous step. So the blue is really dense bone. And then if I move this away, you can see that the red that I'm seeing here is going over some of these darker areas. Now this is a 3D view, so it could be a few slices away from that. Let's try to move this over that root canal there, and you can see that clearly. All right. Mike, any comments on this just basic placement of implants here?
Dave, I mean, this is being able to visualize the implant in relationship to your planned tooth, and whether you're using a stock abutment or a custom abutment is what makes this so great. I'm not sure how many people here are on the lab side of things and how many doctors are on here, but this is a conversation that's really becoming very, very popular right now, is running room between the implant and your anatomical crown and how much space we need. So, I mean, what you showed now is really why this is so powerful. Being able to visualize your abutment, the proposed tooth, what you want in relationship to the implant height is really invaluable.
All right. Awesome. Thanks. So just going over, we have different tabs in these wizards, and I'm doing a lot of things with different hotkeys, and really makes it a lot easier once you start using the product and you start learning how to use the different shortcut keys and things like that. For example, hiding objects just with my keyboard, you know, just kind of makes things a little more efficient. But we do have show and hide groups here that you can change the transparency and also display options that will either present it or hide it. So all of those are broken down here in different categories. You also have different controls here. So if you wanted to lock certain things up, like I just want to move the implant along its axis, I can select that, and the movement will just be locked in that orientation, no matter where I'm looking at it from. So that's helpful if you're looking at it from an obscure angle, just to try to get it positioned in the right place. If you're trying to do this without a locking or a locking of that axis, you might be moving it diagonally across the screen into somewhere that you don't want. So having some additional controls is helpful, and I would certainly explore some of those options, because they'll come into play not on a simple case like this, but maybe on a more comprehensive case where you're trying to create similar angles or match things up to different restorative outcomes. All right, so I'm pretty sure I moved this into, we'll just keep it there. And this last settings tab, this is where you would maybe add an additional implant. So let's say that you were reviewing this. This kind of gives you that initial map that we were looking at here, just on this arch. And this is just flagging that we had selected an adjacent tooth here, and that we have an implant here, that we're deciding whether it's going to be a custom or stock abutment. Now, on the same screen, I can just say, oh, you know what, I need to also add one to number 30. And just by doing that, you've now added a custom abutment, and the software will then prompt you to add an implant on number 30. So that's how you would do that. Or maybe if you started off thinking that you were going to do 3 individual implants and decided you don't have enough room, you can just remove that middle one and create a 3-unit bridge. So much flexibility here, and that's offered here under the settings tab. So we'll exit that, and then this just provides some additional controls here. If the red and blue are interfering or annoying, you can just change that to a standard view. You can also update the safety distance. So if you wanted to increase the safety distance, or maybe just quickly measure how much room you have against the nearest adjacent tooth, you can just quickly update that, and that minimum safety distance measurement is actually recorded on a report that we produce immediately after this step here. So I'll leave that there so you can see that. All right, so the next step here that you see is the surgical guide sleeve. And we can select the manufacturer. So in this case, it defaults to the implant manufacturer, but we can also use third-party sleeves like NT Trading, for example. And NT Trading actually produces a specific Straumann sleeve that works with the surgical kit. So what you see here are 3 different dots that correlate to the different prolongation values and spoon distances here that are already taken into account. So when you're using these fully guided kits and you follow the surgical protocol, it will get you to the right position at the right angle and also to the right depth. So in this case, it's a 24 millimeter depth from the top of this spoon here to the bottom of the implant. Now, we can also switch to something like a universal kit where, let's say that you just wanted to use maybe a different surgical kit that you had available. You can just set that distance to your liking. Or if those prolongation values were too low and you needed to stay above the bone or the tissue level, you can switch to a universal kit. And having some of these sleeves on hand would not be a bad idea. And this would at least give you the pilot so that you at least have the right depth, and then you would increase your osteotomy just directly on the bone. Mike, any comments there? This is really where the clinical aspect comes into play.
So I mean, beyond positioning, everything you said is on point. Depending on, and it depends on if you have what system you're using, what guide sleeves you're using. This is semi-customizable to all those situations. Some docs aren't really into the whole full guided thing because, like you said before, once you get into a surgical site and the bone isn't as good or hard or whatever it might be as you thought it would be, you may need to think on the fly. So being able to plan a case and having at least that pilot drill so that you're in the ballpark of where you want to be, both depth, position-wise and angulation-wise, helps significantly. But everything you said up until now encompasses all of that. I don't think we want to get into how to position an implant relative to other teeth, because that's not really the purview of this. But everything you said up until now is on point. And planning a case fully guided and with a backup pilot guide is the way I would recommend doing it, just in case things are a little bit different once you open your flap.
All right. Yeah, thanks for that. So once you select next and you've set the surgical sleeve where you want it, you can then approve the case. And this approval is kind of time-stamped, and a surgical or an implant planning report is now generated in the software. So this gives you the ability to now forward this to a lab if, let's say that you're not interested in having a 3D printer yourself. You can certainly work with a partnering lab or production center and just forward the plan along. And they have the ability to, for example, I'll switch back to the database here. Instead of going into implant planning, if they receive an external case, they can simply go to, and you just saw it light up here because now I have an implant planning, there's a file that gets created here, implant planning info, and that maintains all of the position and data that was already planned. So now in this case, I can just go into surgical guide and deal with the surgical guide design without any risk of inadvertently moving the implant somewhere. And if it does, the software will actually prompt you for an additional approval. So if you're a lab technician and collaborating with a doctor and you see that approval, that's a good cue to send that back to the doctor for an additional review. And sometimes you may find that you're working on the guide design and something just doesn't quite work out. Maybe the sleeve position is too low and you just need more space. So you can send something back with maybe an elevated sleeve position, and then they could sign off on that again. Now that said, we do have a system called Dental Share that's built into all of our products that with a single click you can find your collaborative partner and the case data just transfers back and forth. So it does make it easier to avoid having to export and maybe have different versions of this case in different areas. So I would certainly, well, that's out of the scope of this discussion, but certainly something to look into when you're collaborating with an outside party.
Dave.
So just go ahead.
Somebody was asking, and just so everybody knows, I know the chat function's down, so just use the questions function and we'll get to some of them at the end. But somebody was wondering if you can play with the sleeve diameter.
You can to a degree. So exoplan was positioned as a medical device, so we do validate all of the libraries that are created. And at the moment, we have that capability turned off or not available to end users. We do have tools that we provide to partners where they're creating their surgical geometry, and that goes through an extensive validation within our internal team, and then we forward all of that for approval within with every iteration of the software updates. So we are approaching this a little differently. If you are an advanced user and have been using this for a while, you'll find that in other design tools or implant planning tools where you have the freedom to create those different diameters. Now, that's not saying that you can't adjust the diameter off of that geometry so that it fits into the guide, and I'll show you that once we're starting to do the guide design. But to just freely create a different diameter set, it's not going to be possible in this version. But you know, once you become familiar with the libraries that are included, you'll find that a lot of the diameters that you're already looking for will already be there. And pretty much exocad has a fundamental rule that we just work with anyone that is willing to work with us. So we're not blocking out any partners, or really the way that we prioritize our requests for these libraries is the more requests that we get from the field, we bring those requests up to the top. So if there's a lot of users that are asking for a specific library that doesn't exist yet, we work with that partner to get that introduced into the software. So if you do have a library that you're using that you don't find is in the system already, just reach out to us or reach out to that manufacturer and let them know to send us a geometry file, and those libraries can be created. So I'm just kind of scrolling through. Go ahead, Hall.
One more question. They were wondering, how do you make guided plan and pilot guide for the same case?
Oh, yeah, easily. So back through expert mode, well, even right here, if I just save this out, let me go back to expert mode here. I can right click and save this scene and just give it a name like, pilot, for example. And that saves a version of this that I can then go back to. So I can complete my design with one variation and then quickly go back into this saved scene and make the changes that I want and then design the guide for that specific one. So that would probably be one way of doing it. There's probably other ways as well that are probably more advanced, but that would be the way I would recommend, because then you have both versions that you can manipulate separately. Mike, do you have any suggestions on that?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed it. It really depends if the pilot guides, the pilot sleeves you're using are in the same kit of the same implant that you chose or not. But I think that how you described it might be best. From a safety standpoint, for me personally, I would probably just do the case in two separate files, just to kind of keep everything organized so everyone knows what's on the same page. So you have a PDF that's generated for that pilot. But the way, like you said, it's more of an advanced thing if you want to kind of save as along the way versus making two different, DB files.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so that's the other option. So Mike was mentioning just creating a new case for the same patient and working up the case again with a different. Is that what you were saying, Mike?
Yes.
Okay. So you handle it through the database by creating two separate sessions. Yeah, and the way I described it was pretty much to create two different implant planning files on the same case. So many ways to skin a cat here. Those are probably two of the most popular ways to do it. And there's even different versions of that as well. So I think we can table that one for a different topic.
I agree. And Dave, you kind of discussed this. Holly just sent a question over of how many sleeve libraries are available. I mean, I know you have a PDF. exocad has a PDF of all the implant libraries and the compatible sleeves. So I don't know if you want to wait till the end to show that, or if that's something aesthetic professionals will send out.
I'll just bring it up really quick and just show everyone how to access that. If you go to exocad.com and you get integration, go down to the last tab here. And near the top of the page, you'll see a couple of links. In the US, you'll want to use the overview of supported implant libraries for the US. Everything that we include in this library will already, we have documents on hand from each of these manufacturers that have FDA approval. So this is a good reference of just being able to correlate what you may be using to what we have in our library and also verify that they are FDA approved. We do have a generic library with other international companies that may not have an interest here in the US or a sales body. So that's why I would recommend this particular document. But here you can see the different manufacturers and whether they provide a fully guided option or pilot, different comments, and then we also have a listing of compatible prosthetic components that we have in our DentalCAD library. So towards the bottom, I believe we have a section for the sleeve systems. Yes, so the available sleeves are listed here. So something you guys can take a look at offline there. So great questions, by the way. Thank you for that. Now, going into the surgical guide design, and I know we're probably bleeding over the time here, so hopefully we're still okay. I think most of us are at home. But right here we have some basic parameters where you can just change the diameter of the sleeve housing. Now this is the plastic where these metal sleeves are going to be pushed into. What you see in red is actually a cutting surface. So as you can imagine, once we design the template that goes around these teeth here, that plastic is going to be offset from this cast surface. And in doing so, some of the plastic is coming up over the guide site. So this area here in red will actually be used to cut everything in the red area out to allow room for the handpiece to seat down onto that surface. One thing that I actually like to do, so here's a tip, is I make that larger so that I get a couple of built-in viewing windows so I can see that the guide is seated all the way down. So that's kind of a tip that I've been providing lately, and we'll get into some inspection window stuff a little later. We also have the radial sleeve offset. So we were talking about adjusting the diameter of the guide. So if you have a guide sleeve and you print it out on a 3D printer, you may find that the guide that or the sleeve that you're trying to insert is really restrictive or there's too much friction. So you can adjust that offset by changing this here. And what that does is it creates a small layer here so that you can insert that sleeve a little more comfortably. I would say a good starting point is at 60 microns. That will probably encompass a lot of the tolerance that we see today in the marketplace with pretty much any of the reputable 3D printer companies. If you put it at a 60 micron gap, you're generally in a really good starting point. Now, if you find that that's still too tight, you can increase that a little bit, but I would recommend starting at 60 microns. Another cool feature, and this kind of goes into the immediate provisionals or, if you're trying to get the timing of the implant right, you can define the hex angle of the underlying implant on the guide itself. So here you can see a little triangle that popped up here, and that marks an angle. You can also mark an edge, and that inverts the direction of the triangle. So you can kind of see what that's referencing there. So those are a couple of options, and that's built directly into the library. So if the manufacturer provides us with the angular data, that's going to just be built into the software. The next step in designing the guide is creating the block out. So, if we just design plastic to fit over the surface, we're going to find that will just lock into the teeth. And we don't necessarily want that. So you can block this out with 0-degree undercut. You can also adjust an offset. So again, I would recommend increasing this a little bit. So this is the offset. Think of it as the spacer if you're familiar with the CAD process. So this is the space between the surface of the teeth and the guide. So right now, by default, we have it at 30 microns. 30 might be a good starting point. I would probably bump that up a little bit, but this is all specific to your individual printers. And then you can also have somewhat of a snap fit on these guides. So this parameter here tells the software allow undercuts up to 100 microns in this case. And what that does is it will block everything out, but leave 100 microns right at the edge here where the guide can kind of go over that height of contour and just kind of lock in. And that seems to be a nice feature that they like having that rigid worry about holding that at the same time that they might be inserting spoons onto the drill guides. Mike, do you have any feedback on that, like how you prefer to design your guides?
You know, Dave, a lot of this comes down to printer, like you just said, printer tolerances. And if you're not a lab and don't really understand how the printing works or haven't printed that much, this is more of a trial and error thing, more than anything else. And I wouldn't suggest printing a model and trying a surgical guide on a printed model. I would probably pour a stone model or an epoxy model and try your printed guides on that, because sometimes when you print things, it may seem fine, but in the mouth it doesn't. So this is a lot of trial and error to nail the parameters based on individual printers, humidity, temperature, all those things come into factor when you're printing and setting these parameters.
Yeah, and fortunately, there's not that many parameters that you have to worry about nowadays. The materials have come a long way since the beginning of 3D printing, and these newer desktop printers are even to the point where they have QR codes that actually preset some parameters and stuff on the printing software to compensate for specific readings that they got off of a batch. So things have gotten way better, but you're still going to find that some of these parameters, these 2 or 3 parameters, will go a long way in helping you just refine that fit to your liking. All right, so this is the surface now that is blocked out, and you can kind of see how this green area kind of just shows how much was blocked out. So this is now the surface that we're going to be working on moving forward. And you can kind of see that just kind of as a transparent view. Now, the next step is to just define the border of the guide. So if I want this to be more of a quadrant, I can just kind of bring that out. Now you could bring this all the way around the arch. I'll just kind of stop it here around the midline and then come back around. And here you can set the thickness that you want, so 2.5 millimeters by default. Also, the smoothing level of how smooth you want that guide to be on the top. So it's as easy as that template gets generated. Now, if you look at the underside, this is just still a big blob of material right now. We haven't performed the cut against that underlying mask just yet. So once we hit OK, this is just a warning message saying, hey, this sleeve or this guide might be touching the top of the the implant, that's okay. It's common that that happens, but just know that the guide is going to be cut to the surface tissue. So this is a viewing window. So we introduce these to allow you to have a visual of whether the guide is seated all the way or not. So one thing I would mention here is you probably don't want this to go all the way through the guide. It might create a stress point. So I like to just kind of forward that little window to half of the guide, you know, something like that. You can also change the size and height and stuff like that. The thickness and length are controlled here. So I would probably do something like that. Now remember, I had this cylinder that's going to cut this area. So we're actually going to be able to see those teeth there on the adjacent sides. And one other feature that I like to do, because some of these guides will be batch printed overnight, especially if you're in a production center, you just want to add a label on this. And you know, you can do that. You have control over what gets printed on there. You can also change the size and direction. So something like this, all right? Let's just kind of move that right here, increase the size a little bit. And if I preview this, you can see what that looks like. So that's what your guide will look like. All right, so once we hit next, this will now merge and calculate all of the necessary offsets and cut the bottom surface of that guide. And so now you don't see any of that blob coming up from underneath the cast. And what we present as a final step is just a thickness map. So this may expose some areas where you may want to bulk up the guide, right? So so if I go to freeform here, I can add material, let's say in this area, if I want to increase the rigidity there. And you can just kind of see that updated in real time. So just adding a little bit more material there will help you out, make sure that that doesn't snap there. So just want to see maybe a lot more yellow here in this area since we created that window cut. And then you could go in and smooth things out if you want as a final step.
Dave,
Go for it.
You may have just answered this question, but somebody is wondering how they can place lateral pins for stability.
Lateral pins. You're talking about like anchor pins or fixation pins?
I'm guessing that's what he's talking about.
Yeah, so this actually takes us to, I think, the next topic, and we're pretty much finished up with the design. So I'll get right back to that question. So thanks for asking that. So let's go into the surgical guide protocol. So so you get two different reports. One is implant planning that tells you information about the implant site and different cut views and stuff that you can insert into the patient record. And then the surgical guide report is something that will contain all of the information about the handles that would be used, the diameters, the depth of the handle. If there's a drill color code, that's going to be presented here as well. So again, we work with reputable manufacturers that provide all of this information to the users, and also you'll find part numbers and all that stuff. So if you're a production center and providing implant planning services as an option for clients, you know, this is a great report to send back with the guide. So let's go back into to that. So this is pretty much that's it. That's the guide. This is now an available STL. So this can feed directly into your implant, your 3D printing software, or even some mills. But that's your surgical guide STL that's produced directly from the software. So there's no click fees, there's no per use fees or anything like that. Once you have the software, you're able to do unlimited designs and produce these as you move forward. So Mike, I think this is a good time now to maybe talk about, so we had the question from fixation pins. This is commonly used in edentulous cases, and our upcoming release, which is called 3.0 Galway, we name our software based on cities of culture in Europe. The company's founded and based out of Europe, so every year there's an organization that defines these cities of culture, and we started naming our software versions based off of each of these cities that are presented every year. So this year's release of Exoplan will feature a dual scan protocol where you can actually correlate two different CBCTs instead of a CBCT to an optical scan like we did. And the software will go through and automatically map those points. And then also one of the added features is the ability to add fixation pins. So we've created an additional library with different fixation pins, and those are going to be available as well. So hopefully that answered that last question that came in. Mike, do you want to provide any additional insights on some of the software that you've been beta testing for us?
So, the dual arch protocol is going to open up a lot of doors for immediate dentures and immediate full arch placement as far as all on 4, all on 6, and it's going to help take away that reline stage that most protocols require right now. So that's going to be a huge thing moving forward. Now, as far as simple surgical guides go, you had mentioned the windows. The windows are super key for these cases, and you also mentioned full arch guide versus a partial guide. The bigger we start making these guides, the more support pins you start to place, the harder it is to work in the mouth. You're starting to add a lot of things that go in the way. It's very uncomfortable for the patient. So that's one thing to kind of note as you're designing these guides. I think that it's most critical to put a window to confirm seating instead of making a full arch guide. But again, that comes down to the clinician. Other things that the prototypes have right now moving forward is just streamlining the process, making these guides very, very quick moving forward. But beyond that, the immediate fixation and immediate provisionalization and immediate prosthetics that are going to be possible moving forward is going to make this type of dentistry easier and faster for the patient, assuming the products that you're using, meaning the implants you're using, are approved for that use.
Yeah, excellent point. And you certainly want to work with reputable distributors, and don't go for cheap products that you find online and stuff. You want to make sure that these products, they're going into a human at the end of the day. So I know that there's a lot of options, especially now with online shopping. Mike, you struck a great point there. You want to make sure that these products are FDA approved and regulated, and that they're coming from known sources, and try to avoid just off-brand imitations and things like that we see very often overseas. So Holly, do we have maybe other questions that might have come in there at the end?
Yeah, there was one that came in earlier. After planning a guide, are you able to make a temp that will fit your plan? Is it possible?
Perfect question.
Okay.
Yeah. And what was the last part of that?
Well, they're wondering if they can input the designed temp that can be used to place after the placement of the guide. So can they input the designed temp into it?
Yeah, okay. So I think we touched on that earlier, where we were creating a tooth from a library, but that same design could have come from a virtual wax up that I have already done. So let's assume that that is your the outer shell of the temporary that you're planning for that patient. So that temp can actually be imported along with your model scans or your intraoral scan or whatever it may be that you're introducing into Exoplan. So that can come along as an object that you're planning to. Upon completion of the planning session, you can immediately, and we'll save this for a different session, but certainly one that we're certainly considering following up with. But it's what we call the immediate load workflow. And from Exoplan, you can take that same position and bring it into the CAD software of exocad and continue with the design of a custom abutment, a custom healing abutment, a screw retain restoration. So all of these things are possible without having to have a scan body in place. So before you even have the patient in the chair, you can already have a provisional or a temporary that's already designed and ready to go. In case the protocol is followed, the surgical guide is used, the implant's in place, the timing is correct, and now you have a very nice temporary that's already manufactured and ready to load. That being said, there's many schools of thought on whether that's doable or not. So, this goes back to your clinical experience, what the literature says, journals, and things like that. And I think on whether that patient is suited implant. And Mike, I think you have some comments on that too. You're very close to the research on that.
Dave, you cut out a little bit on that, so I'm assuming you're talking about the immediate loading on things?
Yes.
Okay. So, moving forward, exocad has done an incredible job allowing for immediate prosthetics, both for all on 4, all on 6, and for single tooth provisionalization and immediate loading. That does not mean that all implant companies are approved for immediate loading. Now, immediate loading is two different things. It's all on 4, all on 6. That's one type of immediate loading, and then there's a single tooth immediate load. And I know most dentists don't do this, but we really need to go into the FDA and read the guidelines of the implants that you're purchasing, because most implants on the market are not approved for single tooth immediate loading. So the software allows for it moving forward, but it's a real case-by-case basis, and I just want to kind of veer on caution with that stuff. For example, I just pulled up Straumann's BLX 510K submission, which is what allows for immediate loading, and their reference is that in cases of fully edentulous patient, 4 or more implants must be used for immediate loading cases. So what they're saying is that for that system, yes, you can immediately load, but you must have 4 implants placed, which allows for cross-arch stabilization. So very important. All the sales reps will tell you, yeah, you can immediately load, but in the end of the day, it comes down to your due diligence. Hello?
Awesome. And any other questions, Holly?
Yeah, this was a good question regarding the upcoming release. They were wondering if it's possible to edit the model STL.
Edit the model STL. So there will be some editing tools. You can also, if you remember that step where Oh, you're probably talking about virtually extracting teeth, which is also a new feature. Mike, you've been testing that recently, but it offers a single-click solution for removing the tooth and then closing the hole on the underlying mesh so that you can still design a guide over it. I think that's one scenario where you would want to do mesh editing. Now, there are some mesh editing tools that are fairly basic, like cutting and closing holes and stuff like that, which will be exposed in the next version. And there's also some free-forming tools that you can use to maybe compensate for a broken cusp or something if you have to add material to a certain area. You can do that even in this version with that mesh that we did the undercut for. There was a tab in that step that allows you to do some free-forming. And primarily it was there for maybe customizing the block out, but you can also use it to add material on certain areas that you think might need a little more relief. And that kind of plays hand in hand with the virtually extracted teeth. It is just a computer algorithm that's identifying the outer contours of the tooth that you're clicking on for the clinical crown. So that gets removed, it gets filled in, but maybe the adjacent teeth, you may want to add a little bit of relief to make sure that you have enough room for the guide so that it doesn't interfere there and you don't have to adjust it intraorally. So that's some comments from my side on the STL editing.
And I'll add to that the virtual extraction feature in the prototype is fantastic. It can be done currently with the current versions. It requires a little bit of expert mode and some filling in holes, and it may not be perfect, but in the prototype, the virtual extraction works wonderfully.
All right, thank you.
Great. I have a couple people asking about designing bone reduction guides. Is that possible?
So there's a really great Facebook group out there that's got like 35,000 users. It's ridiculous. But if you guys follow it, just join the group. It's publicly available, and it's called exocad Experts. And you'll see tons of stuff that people are doing with these guides. Bone reduction is one of them. Even though we have not currently worked out workflows for it, stackable guides is something else I've been seeing pop up there. Again, more advanced uses of these scenarios, but exocad is so flexible that people find ways to just make the tools work for what they're trying to do. So I've already seen that stuff. In the case of bone reduction guides, even with this version, you could really do it. Just take the basic tools of those cutting windows that we were just doing to cut with. If you design your guide based off of the surface generated of the bone, you can overlay the guide over the bone surface and then use those cutting windows to seat down on the area that you want to reduce to. So that's one variation that I've seen. Something we can't really demonstrate right now due to the time. We're, I think, way over at this point, but the questions are coming in, so I'm still available. Mike, I appreciate you staying on. Please don't feel obligated if you have other commitments, but I'm still available at this time.
Okay, let me see, I just have a couple more. Those surgical guides, I think they're like a spaghetti style. Somebody was wondering about if that was possible to make. Do you understand what they're saying? I think they kind of look like rope wax. I forgot what company they were with.
Yeah. So you can. Let's back up a couple of steps because this is something that can easily be demonstrated here. So imagine that we had a bunch of sites here, and we can go into like support round, for example, and just add structure like that and just kind of tie those together. I think that's what they're referring to. It's these very minimalist guides that don't necessarily go over the tooth form, but they're just kind of saddling over the implant sites and then just kind of connected with these thin geometries, and you can kind of shape these longer and wider if you need to for stability. But I think that's what they're referring to. If not, again, you can probably just cut out certain sections that you want removed. Now, the next version does have a site-to-site feature where it kind of uses our algorithms for bridge connectors, where you can select two of these cylinders, and it just forms a connection between the two. So that can also be used in its place as well.
Okay, great. I have another question. Can you plan a micro implant surgery for an orthodontics treatment?
So I don't know the depth of our implant libraries. Please take a look through what's available now, and if not, I can't imagine that the procedure would be very different to what we're doing now. So certainly, I think that would be possible. The library may just not exist. So if you could please reach out to representatives from those manufacturers if the library is not currently in our system, and we can certainly work with them to implement that type of functionality.
Okay, I think that was all of the questions that we have.
Awesome.
Yeah, I thank you so much for doing this, and I just want to let everybody know we will have this video available for you. Just check your email. Later on today, I'll be sending one out with our upcoming webinars, and then from there we'll figure out what kind of platform we're going to put this on, and we'll send that out to you.
All right, Holly, thanks for the opportunity. Mike, thank you very much for being on there. That was great content and feedback from the clinical perspective. We really appreciate working with you, and thank you again for everyone that was in attendance.
Very welcome, Dave.
Great, thank you.
Have a good day, guys.
Thanks, you too.
Have a good day. Bye.